Welcome to GAF Lockdown, our regular show where we educate ourselves for the struggle to come. Today, we are going to be talking with Rhiannon Firth about how to stop the state for co-opting and repressing mutual aid initiatives. But first, let me remind you what is GAF and how can you get involved with us. The Green Anti-Capitalist Front is an alliance of groups and individuals united by a belief that capitalism is one of the core causes of the environmental crisis threatening us all, and that if we don't act now, the cost of that crisis will fall on the poor and powerless. If you want to get involved, you can contact one of the existing groups, which you can find in places like London, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, among others. All the contact info is in our website. But also remember that GAF is a front, and as such, as long as you agree with our aims and principles, you can create your own collective or take action under the GAF banner without having to ask for permission. Finally, before we begin, today I want to start a new tradition of making a few announcements about current struggles around the world and locally that you can join if you want to. So, first of all, I want to talk about a new project called the Mutual Aid Federation. The Mutual Aid Federation aims to be a forum for cooperation and discussion between mutual aid groups from across the UK, aligning to grassroots organizing, direct action, and class struggle. Mutual Aid MAF considers how mutual aid can survive and progress, and how groups can work together to create a stronger, more effective movement. The next meeting of the MAF will be looking at how groups can best cooperate and what an effective federal structure might look like. To find out more about upcoming meetings or to get in touch, visit the MAF Facebook at www.facebook.com/mutualaiduk. I'll leave the link. I'll put the link in the chat and in the description of the video once it goes up. So let me just do that. There we go. And also on Twitch, we don't want to leave our Twitch people alone. Also, another important announcement is the International Solidarity Day with anti-fascist prisoners. For the last few years, anti-fascists have marked July 25th with stands and events to show solidarity with imprisoned comrades and to raise awareness for them. Whether a banner drawed or a simply friendly letter of support to one of them in prison, show solidarity with those who have suffered the repression of the police and prison system for standing up against fascism. I'm going to also leave a link with the campaign, but you know this is fairly autonomous, so I'm sure you can find ideas for how to support it. Also, in the same day, there's a call for a day of action in solidarity with Portland and against the federal invasion. The Youth Liberation Front is calling for a day of action in solidarity with the ongoing resistance in Portland. On July 25, youth abolitionists are calling for a national and global march against the institutions of policing. They are demanding justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Stephen Clark, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Quanice Hayes, Patrick Kimmons, Sim Monterosa, and the thousands more taken by the hands of racist police. Time and time again, the neoliberal state has offered promises of reform with no real action ever taken. The time for discussing reform is over. We need full abolition for our communities to be safe and free from rampant police terror. They are calling on all abolitionists, youth or non-youth, to coordinate mass protests on July 25th to show the world that the fire of this uprising is still burning strong and that flames will just keep getting bigger until the police state has been dismantled once and for all. Form an affinity group, coordinate an action, get tactical, mask up, bring a friend, show up. And finally, I also want to call attention to the ongoing Mapuche hunger strike. The Mapuche are an indigenous people who have been defending their native territory of Wild Mapu against invasion for hundreds of years, from the Incas and the Spanish Empire to the countries of Chile and Argentina today. They don't recognize the legitimacy of these states to rule over them and over the land they protect from the destruction brought about by corporations trying to spoil the natural riches it contains. As such, they have suffered political assassinations and incarcerations over the years, and today 25 Mapuche political prisoners are on a hunger strike to demand their release from prison by the Chilean following international agreements signed by the government to recognize the autonomy of indigenous people to self-govern. Furthermore, with the COVID-19 crisis, the conditions the prisoners are subjected to are a death sentence, and so it's absolutely necessary that they are released from prisons and allowed to return to their land so they can be looked after by their own people. There's not a specific call to action, but I'm sure you can think of many ways you can support it, from banner drops and communicates to, thinking what companies and states around the world are contributing to this ongoing crisis and how can you get in their way. And also as a way of getting more information about the ongoing Mapuche struggle, I would recommend checking the Mapuche International link, a charity based in Bristol, I believe, that publishes information in English, which is a bit hard to find otherwise. So I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And again, that will be put in the description of the video. Yeah, I think that's all. For now, in terms of introductions and preambles, so without anything else, I just want to give the opportunity to our guests to talk and take over. So, Rhiannon, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Good. Okay. Shall I get started?
Yes, please. Yeah, and first of all, thanks so much for being here, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Okay, hello everyone. My name's Rhiannon. I'll just introduce myself and the research a little bit first so that you have some context before I get into this presentation, which is part of a much bigger project. I've been working on mutual aid disaster relief since about 2015. I'm a researcher at university, but this research isn't part of my current project. So this is actually, most of what I'm doing is independent research that I'm doing in my spare time. And I'm writing a book, which I already had a contract for before the COVID-19 crisis kicked in, which was partly based on some empirical work with Occupy Sandy, which I went over to New York 3 years after the Hurricane Sandy occurred, and I interviewed activists that had been involved with that about mutual aid disaster relief. And then also the book's sort of largely theoretical, and it's a critique of mainstream disaster policy, and then it sort of looks at mutual aid in anarchist theory, and then it looks at practice. So when sort of the COVID-19 crisis began and mutual aid groups started to sort of organise around me in London, I thought that since I was writing this book, most of which is already written and the theory I've already got in place, I thought it'd be a bit remiss of me not to sort of interview and engage with my comrades in London as well. So I've done some interviews with some people who I'm very grateful to indeed. And during that process, I sort of agreed to do this partly as an offer in return, so that I wasn't just sort of taking interviews and so on, taking information from people, but hopefully offering something useful back, perhaps. I haven't analysed the interviews I did yet, and in fact, I could do with taking a few more interviews. So, I mean, if anyone's interested in the research and would be willing for me to interview them at the end of this, and perhaps they can get in touch with me. So that's not the focus of this presentation, although I will touch on the COVID-19 crisis, because obviously that's of interest, a very present interest. So what I usually do when I give presentations in academic settings is I usually give presentations advocating or arguing for the anarchist position or a radical position to people who aren't necessarily sympathetic to that position. So what I've been asked to do here is quite different, because obviously that wouldn't be particularly useful or relevant to most people on this call who are already on board with me on that, hopefully. So I'm really excited and honoured and a bit nervous about giving this talk because it is, as I say, different. But actually, I just finished writing my chapter 2 of the book. So this is based on chapter 2, which is a critique of the mainstream disaster policy. Because not only is it good timing, because I've just finished it, so it's sort of fresh in my mind, but I also thought that if I'm offering something useful back to movements, then perhaps all this research I've done on these sort of rather pernicious mainstream policies, which are explicitly aimed at repressing and co-opting mutual aid movements, might be some useful knowledge for people who are engaged in mutual aid movements, but might not be as aware as I am, having spent ages researching it, of sort of quite what the policy towards them and so on is. And then I'm going to look a little bit at how that's affected Occupy Sandy, and also the sort of effects that that kind of policy had on the environment in London for COVID mutual aid groups. I'm going to look a bit less at how people have resisted that, but a little bit. And then I was hoping to open for discussion at the end, what people in the chat think. I'm hoping to sort of engage in a discussion about tactics, because obviously I've been involved in some action, but I'm less involved than other people, and certainly some people in this call. So I feel like I want to open the discussion on that particular point. So a lot of the talk is going to be about the kind of what is repression and co-optation, and sort of what does that look like in policy, I suppose, so that we've got a strong basis for thinking about how to resist that. Sorry, I just muted myself by mistake. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna sorry, I didn't quite finish writing this slide. I was sort of rushing this summary at the end. I'm going to start with some definitions and recommended reading. I'm going to give a bit of historical background to mainstream disaster management. I'm going to give some more detail and concepts. I'm going to look at it in policy, and then I'm going to look at how that's affected movements. Sorry, these are the bits I left off it. I'm going to look at how it's affected movements, and then I'm going to move on to thinking of some tactics against it. Okay, so some definition. So repression, I'm going to take the sort of simple colloquial dictionary definition. It's the action of subduing someone or something by force. Co-optation means subsuming outsiders, so perhaps autonomous groups or autonomous people, into the elite or mainstream in order to manage opposition and maintain stability. So it's I pretty much treat it as synonymous with another word that's often used in radical circles, recuperation. And then I'm going to look at the concept of disaster, because we're looking at disaster policy here. So there's multiple contested definitions of disaster. The mainstream definition, that the kind of stuff I'm looking at today works with, views disasters as negative events with one community impact, so it affects a large number of people, not just one. Number two, which exceed the capacities of local agencies to respond or recover. Because if local agencies can respond or recover, it's usually seen as an accident rather than a disaster. And the third aspect of the mainstream definition is that disasters do not exceed the entire capacity of the social systems combined to respond, because something that did would be seen as a catastrophe or a collapse. So that's the mainstream definition. And it's about the ability to return to normal. You can't return to normal using local agencies, so you have to sort of call on broader sources. We're going to look at the problems of that later. Radical definition of capitalism would say that capitalism is a disaster. It's a sort of reversal of perspective, and we'll look at that in more detail throughout the presentation. But a recurring theme is that a radical definition of disaster doesn't see it as a rupture in which we want to return to normal. It sees it as kind of showing us something about capitalism which is inherent within capitalism. Okay, so some resources and recommended reading about this. I've got two particularly emblematic examples here of sort of what informs disaster policy. So Quarantelli is often seen as the father of disaster studies, and I've given an example of one of his papers, but he's written reams and reams of stuff that you can look at, and he's particularly symbolic of the kind of paradigm I'm looking at today. And there's also a document called by the Department for Homeland Security, who have been in the news a lot recently because of their actions in Portland at the moment. But they wrote a report about Occupy Sandy called The Resilient Social Network. And I've put on the presentation note, these are not radical or anarchist papers. Hopefully that should be obvious coming from the Department of Homeland Security. But if you actually read it, it sounds quite sympathetic. In fact, parts of it almost sound radical. So they sometimes sound like they value grassroots movements and decentralized organizing, but this is because they seek to co-opt it or repress it ultimately. So what I'm going to argue today is that these perspectives are important because they strongly inform government policies. Anarchists and other radicals need to know about them in order to effectively resist. But as far as I'm aware, they haven't been critiqued from an anarchist perspective yet. So my purpose today is, number one, to look at the political theories underlying attempts to co-opt movements, and to look at how these kind of are played out in policy documents. Secondly, to look at the experience of Occupy Sandy, who had this particular policy document sort of written about them. And then finally, to discuss possible tactics for resisting co-optation. Okay, so I'm going to have a look at a bit of background to disaster studies. I'm going to start with some sort of deep historical background, which is the transition from sort of Fordism to post-Fordism. So the emergence of disaster studies follows the transformation of the relationship between state and capital, from Fordism, which was a centralized and organized form of capital based on mass production and consumption, where the state acts as an organizer and stabilizer for capital, through things like providing people with welfare, social housing, and so on, to post and through sort of nationalized industry as well. Now, the transition through, beginning maybe a decade or so before I was born, so, starting in the 70s, I guess, and intensifying during the 80s, the transition to post-Fordism and neoliberalism led to a more precarious, so-called flexible economy, which is much more subject to shocks. So the state relinquished somewhat its stabilizing role. And it relinquished its welfare functions in favor of new public management, which was a state and capitalist logic with decentralized cybernetic components. I'm going to have a look at the definition of cybernetic in a moment. Okay, so disaster management is going on in this context. So disaster management dates back to World War II, and it's got a background in behaviorism and cybernetics. And there's this guy called Norbert Wiener, who's quite a big name in this field. And during the war, he was charged with predicting enemy aircraft behavior, and he invented this new discipline called cybernetics, where he looked at kind of airplanes and their pilots in terms of inputs and outputs. So it basically treats humans as being machine-like. Now, this heavily informed disaster policy. Disasters are defined as ruptures in the normal functioning of society. So a cybernetic approach to disaster management emphasizes a rapid return to normal, and it relies on rational choice behavior modeling. So it sees humans as kind of individualistic, opportunity-seeking agents who can kind of be bribed with structural adjustments and nudges and so on, and incentives. So the way to control people is through sort of punishments and incentives. So basically, it's about indirectly controlling the population through environmental design rather than through a more hierarchical sort of command and control where you just tell people what to do and they're expected to do it, which was the kind of previous kind of way these things would have been done. So linked to this, early disaster researchers used to speak very fondly and laud the idea of a post-disaster utopia, which sounds like a radical concept, but it's actually got conservative origins. So the idea was that people would put aside their differences and roll up their sleeves in order to work selflessly during the recovery effort. You know, and this was all seen in as being in the interest of this, you know, of the recovery of the nation and so on. So these people believed solidarity and mutual aid was temporary. So the differences and divisions would inevitably settle in after the disaster, and they'd require a specialised bureaucracy to administrate. So this guy Quarantelli, who I said is particularly emblematic of this standpoint, he talks about how disaster planning ought to deal with aggregate data, and it ought to focus on general principles and not specific details. And it should also be vertically and horizontally integrated. So I'm going to look in more detail about what that means. What does he mean by, he's trying to carve out this new discipline of disaster management, which needs to focus on general principles, not on specific details. You don't have a special hurricane agency and a special flood agency to deal with floods, or you don't have a special East London agency to deal with East London. Or you don't just get the military in. He's trying to say we need a special discipline of disaster management. Okay, so as disaster management evolved, it's about managing disasters, and it sort of transformed into disaster risk reduction. So early disaster management said that disasters are natural and they need to be managed within the current framework. However, during the development of the paradigm, debates arose about how social, economic, and political constructs, so basically the way societies are built, the way wealth is distributed, how these can create and magnify risk for certain populations. So some of these researchers started to argue quite rightly, I guess, that disasters are not merely ruptures in the normal running of things, but they're actually part of long-running socio-cultural patterns of inequality. So inequalities like race, class, and gender and their intersections make people more vulnerable to the effects of disasters. So it's not just a disaster itself, it's not a natural disaster, it's all disasters have social elements. And this is widely accepted now. So these people were seeking a way to empower communities in their own recovery, and they argued that active participants were less likely to suffer trauma than passive victims. And they argued that for community resilience. We'll look into that in more detail in a minute. So initially, this was seen as a challenge to the technocratic focus of behaviorism, and it was based in the New Left, partly in neo-Marxism, feminism, racial critique, and an increased attention to climate change. So some of the earlier texts read quite sympathetically and somewhat critical, but not as radical as I'd like. But this sort of discourse quickly got absorbed into the centrist third way through ideas of risk society and self-help. So it ended up in practice resulting in policies around privatization of debt and risk. So, for example, through supporting people to buy their own homes and buy public housing, and it was seen that homeowners would take responsibility and be more likely to help themselves. So the vulnerability approach and the resilience approach are sometimes seen as in tension or contradictory, but I think they're two sides of the same coin, really. Vulnerability focuses on the ways in which disasters magnify inequalities, but it ultimately seeks stability, and it neglects how disasters are beneficial to capitalism. It doesn't really question capitalism. And the resilience approach places responsibility for higher level shocks onto lower level communities and individuals. So my definition of resilience, and obviously this is an informal definition and it's entirely mine, is if you tell someone they need to be resilient, you're basically saying you need to take whatever shit we throw at you. So this whole discourse basically rests on the idea of vulnerable private citizens who need the state to come in and manage and redistribute risk, for example, by giving people loans, which obviously they then have to pay back. And the picture here is of New Orleans post-Katrina, of all these houses that are flooded. I don't know the history behind this particular neighborhood, I'm afraid. I just got this from Google Images when I was presenting. But the idea is that this is obviously a public and a social disaster. But when it's treated as sort of private disaster where people have to, insure their own homes and sort of recover individually, there's obviously something deeply wrong with that. So the idea is that sort of a homeowning community would be more resilient and so on. But to me, it just seems deeply individualized and unfair. Okay, so social capital, I've called it. It's the idea of social capital. So this is another thing that's very prevalent within the disaster literature, especially literature on emergent groups. So the document I told you about, the Department for Homeland Security group document, talks about emergent groups and talks a lot about the importance, and this is prevalent in the discourse as a whole. The importance of citizen groups, non-profits, NGOs, networks, and informal grassroots groups. So there's an emphasis on how local level participation and community is vital in building resilience. So the argument is that top-down processes fail in emergencies because they're not responsible and flexible enough. So in some ways, this sounds a lot like anarchism. And when you read some of these documents, they do sound a lot like anarchism. They're arguing for anarchist modes of organizing quite often in terms of emergent groups, non-hierarchical groups, bottom-up processes, participation. It often sounds really radical, but it relies on the idea of social capital. So the idea is that the grassroots is not good on its own terms, but it's only good in terms of the value it has for capitalism and capitalists. And ultimately that value is profit. And the clue's in the name, it's social capital. It deploys assumptions that movements can be co-opted and channeled, often through not only, but often through a process of NGOization, so funding them and turning them into official NGOs, in order to promote cohesion, development, and community. So the idea is that the state can effectively impose cohesion by deciding what a valid group is, what's recognized as a group. So this kind of discourse and policy encourages NGOs and the grassroots to absorb former state functions, but with the expectation of cooperation with the state. So, for example, funding with conditions attached, or the permission to participate in disaster recovery in a certain area, but only under certain rules and conditions. So they treat all forms of participation as interchangeable. There's no distinction between a bowling club, a workers' party, and a political organisation, as long as it's not a threat to the status quo, and as long as they're serving the purposes defined by the status quo. They're sort of a form of capital. Okay, so that's a sort of very broad overview of some of the key concepts and ideas that we're dealing with. So I'm going to have a look now at DDR. So that, just a reminder, that stands for disaster. Sorry, it should be DRR. I've written it wrong on the slide. DRR, disaster risk reduction, it's short for. Sorry, I got it wrong on the slide. Okay, so it's not just an academic discourse. It feeds into policy and therefore it impacts on social movements. So, for example, this document I mentioned before, the Resilient Social Network, and oddly enough, that's no longer on the Department for Homeland Security site. It was there for years and years and years while I was researching this book, and I referenced it throughout my book, and then it just suddenly disappeared overnight. I think, funnily enough, at the same time as Donald Trump sort of got rid of a lot of climate change type research that was online, it disappeared at the same time as that, oddly. I don't want to speculate why, but it's no longer on any of the government pages, but it is on Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, which is a network and a hub in the USA. Really worth looking at if you've not looked into this stuff before, especially if you've been organising in some of the COVID-19 mutual aid groups. It's like an absolute mine of resources. It's a wonderful site. But that document's on there, so I'd really recommend having a look at it. But don't be convinced by it. I'm sure you wouldn't. Okay, so this document attempts to co-opt. It's literally about Occupy Sandy. So they researched Occupy Sandy. And the document's an attempt to co-opt them and similar groups into a neoliberal framework by stipulating the need for the regulation and coordination. So they talk about how great Occupy Sandy is in this book. They say it's resilient social network. They're full of social capital. So there's that term again, resilient. They even concede that the state ought to learn from Occupy, particularly concerning their use of technology and social media. So basically the situation, I'm going to go into it in more detail in a minute, is that the state needed Occupy Sandy, but at the same time it was threatened by them. Okay, why was it threatened by them? So it's got this, because the state has this contradictory relationship to Occupy Sandy. Okay, so a bit of background. So Hurricane Sandy, in which sort of swept across New York City and New Jersey and all across that area in 2012, led to more than 650,000 homes being destroyed and 147 deaths. So the movement Occupy Sandy drew on the values, infrastructure and volunteers of Occupy Wall Street, which had occurred the year before in 2011. Hopefully I don't need to give too much detail on Occupy Wall Street as a movement. But they were evicted from Zuccotti Park about a year before Hurricane Sandy occurred. So those networks and, you know, groups of people that knew each other and so on were still heavily involved with each other. It was still a very current network. And Occupy Sandy mobilized the latent skills networks and activists into an effective relief effort, which basically outperformed, even in conventional terms, in terms of like number of people saved, amount of money raised and so on, massively outperformed FEMA, which is the United States Federal Emergency Management Association, I think, and the Red Cross, which is a sort of NGO, the largest NGO that's usually involved in disaster relief. They were particularly well known for their use of technology. So they mobilized volunteers through social network platforms. They mobilized donations through the Amazon.com wedding gift list, where usually a married couple could put up a list of all the lovely crockery and silverware, or, you know, whatever else, tiffin set or whatever they want for their, wedding gift. And then guests at the wedding can order these things. But Occupy Sandy put up sort of requests for thousands of torches and blankets and mold remediation equipment and so on. So people all over the world could go on Amazon and buy it and have it delivered to them. And then in the picture on the slide, which I'm afraid you can't see if you're on audio, but there's a picture of a church. So the movement worked with local community organisations and churches, and sort of had the donations stored in these in order to distribute them. It was an absolutely massive effort. They recruited 60,000 volunteers, which is 4 times more than the Red Cross, to distribute food and blankets, repair communication networks and restore properties. Now it's important to note that mutual aid was happening in communities anyway. Occupy Sandy didn't sort of invent mutual aid. These people weren't like lying around helplessly until Occupy Sandy turned up. But Occupy sort of linked to churches and community groups to a kind of global network. And they provided a network and a platform for coordination for sort of volunteers to come and link into. And they linked to a global movement and donations. And they raised more than $1.36 million from donations. So this caused an embarrassment to the state and government and to traditional relief agencies, particularly FEMA and the Red Cross, who were widely criticised in the media. So Sandy in the state. So I'm going to mention that document again, Resilient Social Network. In that, they critique the official effort themselves. So they critique FEMA and the Red Cross, and they commend rather patronisingly the youthful energy of Occupy Sandy. And they use this, it's so patronising, they use this term sort of youthful and so on throughout the thing. Now, when I went there and interviewed activists, you know, at least half of them were over 40, I think. But, you know, this is how they want to talk about it, the youthful energy. Now, when I spoke to people, activists knew that they were being monitored. They knew that there was sort of, that they were being surveyed by all sorts of different people. But they were surprised that when they saw this report, some of them were, all of them were surprised it was so positive. They didn't expect to be sort of held as this wonderful example. Here's some more quotes from the document. We can learn lessons from Occupy Sandy's successes to ensure a ready and resilient nation. Occupy Sandy's actions spoke much louder than its words, primarily because the urgency of the situation did not leave much time for politicizing. So obviously these, you know, energetic young people just got on with the job, you know. I've got some pictures here of some of their posters, all of which contain sort of radical and anarchist imagery. So the idea that they weren't political is false, basically. But you know, this document's saying they didn't have enough time for politicizing, so you know what they did was good. So more from the document, they sort of argue that mutual aid encourages the empowerment, that's the word they keep using, empowerment of vulnerable populations, because their input is valued. And this is a great contradiction, is that at one point they say mutual aid, blah, 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 does not foster dependence on aid. So they're basically saying that mutual aid doesn't foster dependence on aid. So this is very much a neoliberal point of view, that sort of dependence on aid, as in sort of state welfare, is bad. And they don't seem to see the contradiction between using this word aid twice in the same sentence. So ideas for incorporating emergent groups into the relief effort. So there's sort of lists, checklists of ideas for how they can incorporate these groups into the official effort. Largely around bureaucratization and coordination. So even though most of the document criticizes bureaucracies for being inflexible, and this comes straight from the sort of mainstream of disaster risk reduction policy, the idea is that bureaucracies are inflexible, they're not responsive enough. We need resilient communities and non-hierarchical groups that are flexible and responsive, and don't have as much red tape or whatever. But the primacy of FEMA, or the need for the state, the need for coordination, is never questioned. No one thinks, well, if these groups are better, like all the evidence and empirical work shows that these groups are better at responding than inflexible bureaucracies. We're arguing that ourselves. They never stop to question their own existence. You'd think they'd sort of be wondering what the point in them is, but so they basically, there's this depoliticized use of the term mutual aid. So in a way, it's an attempt to politically neutralize the movement, as by defining it as social capital and resilience. So it's stepping in for state failures without challenge. The idea is that the group, because it doesn't leave much room for politicizing because of the disaster situation, the idea is these groups can step in for state failures, but you know, they're not really supposed to challenge the state. So this is the tension, really, is that the state needed the creative energies of the grassroots for the practical recovery efforts, but at the same time it's threatened by them because they delegitimize it. People might start to say, what's the point in the state? Okay, so I'm going to sort of move some way towards a critique of this viewpoint. So the document appears to have benign intentions. Many Occupy Sandy activists actually interpreted it as such. So some of the people I spoke to were even pleased that sections of the state were apparently learning from their example. And some activists adopted the language of flexibility and resilience themselves, sort of as a point of pride. And many of them were also keen to accept funding and even become an official NGO. And this led to splits in the movement. And there's many articles online actually talking about how this did actually split the movement. Others were more suspicious. So there was a knowledge that the Department of Homeland Security is a security agency who wrote this report, is a security agency that was established in response to 9/11, and their remit includes defense against terrorists and as well as counterinsurgency, as well as disaster management. So sort of, if you want to see some of the things the Department of Homeland Security do, see also recent events in Portland. So the state response to Occupy Wall Street and to community efforts in recovery around Hurricane Katrina had actually included police brutality and violent social control, and these movements were violently repressed. So many activists were aware of this, and they could see the contradiction with the way in which Occupy Sandy was treated. So John Clark, who talks about the movements that organised recovery, grassroots recovery during Hurricane Katrina, talks of de facto ethnic cleansing, mistreatment and exploitation of migrant workers, widespread police brutality, denial of prisoners' rights, collapse of the courts and legal system, unfair evictions, price gouging on rent, discriminatory housing policies, discriminatory reorganisation of the school system, gutting of the healthcare system. So there's sort of some harrowing stories around Katrina, as well as around Occupy Sandy, underneath the surface of this kind of cheerful report. So what I'd like to argue is that sort of stimulus, including economic stimulus, are encouraging grassroots groups and trying to co-opt them, and violent repression are actually two sides of the same coin, and they're both implied in the sort of cybernetic rationality. I've put DDR again, I mean DRR, disaster risk reduction, outlined above. I'm going to go into more detail here about some of the deeper assumptions of disaster risk reduction, and why they imply kind of either co-optation, violent repression, or co-optation. I'm going to have a quick look actually about how the state responded to I'm going to talk for a bit about how the state responded during COVID-19. So the British state did both during COVID-19, co-optation and repression. It actually used the language of mutual aid in its calls for NHS volunteers. So, you know, come and work for free for, you know, the NHS that you pay taxes for, because it's mutual aid. It also told people who were shielding to take responsibility for their own care by, you know, if you can't get your shopping, then reach out to community groups, it said on its official policy for shielding. So, you know, community groups are organised, we take that for granted. It's your responsibility to reach out to those and, you know, get yourself some mutual aid help out there. Basically washing its hands of, so, you know, what it defines its own responsibilities as. So some of the repressive aspects of lockdown policy relied on crowdsourcing policing to communities. So it relied on turning people in the community really into little Stasi to go and sort of watch each other and police each other by creating this kind of moralistic discourse. for example, through media signalling to encourage mutual enforcement and silencing opposition. Sort of words like COVIDiots and so on. And I've got a cartoon on this slide, which unfortunately the audio people won't be able to see, where it's got some kind of people in a lovely house with a grand piano in the background and some art on their stretchers in a lovely garden with the children playing badminton, I think. And then it's got some tower blocks in the background, and these people in the lovely garden are saying, "Seen this about all those people enjoying the sun in the park? So selfish." So the idea is that, you know, everyone ought to behave this, you know, the rules are applied universally to everyone, and everyone's expected to kind of police each other. It's sort of crowdsourcing policing out to communities, because they didn't have enough police to police the lockdown. You know, they got people to do it themselves. So that was a kind of co-optation in a sense, but also several squats were evicted during the pandemic, which to me constitutes a form of violent oppression. So they used this language of mutual aid during the crisis. The community was kind of deemed desirable during the height of the crisis, where, you know, it's seen as necessary to help people who were shielding. But the advice got more individualistic after lockdown eased, and people were told to return to work and stay alert in order to control the virus. So there's this kind of behavioristic cybernetic rationality behind this kind of policy and discourse, where health is kind of treated as a game, which is sick or perceived to have failed. So social structures are largely ignored. So the way in which sort of poverty renders people more vulnerable is largely ignored, or race, or all the other ways in which people are exposed differently to the virus. Neoliberal public health emphasizes personal responsibility for health outcomes. So things like advice to wash or sanitize hands frequently assumes constant access to bathroom facilities, running soap and water, ability to purchase sanitizer, while conditions in workplaces, schools, prisons, care homes and hospitals are outside individual control. And there was very little attention to pay to the ways in which lockdown itself imposed additional risks on vulnerable and inadequately housed people. So basically, this approach kind of mimics a decentralized approach. There was a lot of sort of lauding of community action, people helping each other and so on. But actually, the discourse is the way in which it's treated as a game is actually to achieve desired profitable outcomes for powerful people, sort of through disaster capitalism. So another picture I've got on this slide is this idea to stay home, save lives, and this became a sort of mantra for that was sort of police to communities, and it was seen as almost a sort of form of mutual aid, that you had to stay home to save other people's lives. And certainly I don't disagree with that, but the ways in which home can mean a lot of different things to different people was rarely considered. So it mimics a decentralized approach, but it doesn't look at the kind of vast hierarchies and inequalities within the way that that's applied. Okay, so I'm going to look at some of the assumptions. I've put DDR throughout this whole thing. I'm obviously bad with acronyms. It's DRR, disaster risk reduction. So some of the assumptions and critique. Okay, so there's the idea that disasters are rupture. So this comes up in the definitions a lot. Disaster is a kind of break in the normal running of things. And the purpose of disaster studies and disaster policy is system stability and a rapid return to normal. So it basically takes capitalism for granted. Capitalism is normal, or it's the new normal. And basically, this very definition acts in the interests of capital because it doesn't question it. There's the idea that disasters are generic. So all disasters are the same. It doesn't matter whether it's a hurricane or a flood or a pandemic. The idea that disasters should be treated generically in disaster risk reduction is stated explicitly. So this idea that all kinds of disasters, people, groups, etc., can be managed in a similar way is an exercise in bureaucratic empire building. It's people trying to carve out a role for themselves where they're possibly not even needed, and it justifies the need for central agencies like FEMA or COBRA, who basically aren't specialists in any kind of disaster. They just sort of are experts in this generic disaster policy. Okay, so there's the idea that emergent groups and social movements are helpful as social capital. So they can be co-opted in the interest of capital, otherwise they'll be repressed. Disasters require securitized response, comes up a lot. So there's an over-reliance on police-enforced lockdowns, for example, which occur not only during pandemics. Lockdowns often also occur during so-called natural disasters. And these are often to the detriment of, these securitized aspects are often to the detriment of welfare or medical aspects. So for example, during COVID-19, things like testing and diagnosis, PPE, providing safe accommodation and so on. There's this recurring idea that disasters are apolitical. So, we shouldn't politicize them. There's a focus on good governance, efficiency, technocratic goals, and it undermines the democratic process. However you want to see democracy acting, but particularly if you see it as being a grassroots direct process. It also undermines responsiveness to social movements and popular concerns. There's a massive focus on efficiency and cost effectiveness. These are basically the only principles that they never let go. So these are actually implicit in the policy, but while implicit, market principles are key. So many of the documents, it's almost astonishing how readily they're willing to accept loss of life, and swinging attacks on human rights are accepted, but never is there any question of the importance of efficiency and cost effectiveness. These constitute the basic root of what these people are getting at. And there's also the view of subjectivity. So unlike the previous paradigms where humans were seen as these kind of Hobbesian, chaotic, irrational brutes who needed to be controlled by a sort of top-down state, this sort of decentralizing cybernetic rationality sees people as opportunity-seeking agents who can be manipulated by nudges and incentives and so on. Unless, of course, they start to riot, in which case they become the Hobbesian brutes who need to be repressed again, or if there's some kind of movement that isn't useful to the state. So this view of the human subject ignores the diversity and complexity of human needs, desires, histories, and cultures, and so on. Okay, I'm aware I've been going on for ages. I'm coming to near the end now. So I have, in the work I've done, I've talked to some people about sort of tactics and so on that they've used against repression and co-optation, or about their opinions towards recuperation co-optation. But I don't really want to sort of lecture you lot on that, because I feel like it's something that you may well have experienced or thought about or talked about more than I have. But one thing I am looking at here is some sort of general principles. If we were going to come up with some sort of general principles that oppose or act against the kind of DRR policy, what would they be? So I've sort of followed the point by point thing that was in the previous slide, and offered a sort of utopian alternative. What would the utopian alternative to each of these points be? So rather than seeing disasters as a kind of rupture in the normal running of capitalism, I think we should see disasters as a sort of cosmic or existential threat. They shouldn't be routinely happening. And I think that we should focus on resistance over resilience, so defending spaces of autonomy. Capitalism is designed for disasters, and we can talk more in the discussion about why that might be. Why do disasters keep happening in capitalism? Okay, so in opposition to the idea that disasters are generic and they need a specialized disaster agency, I'd argue that autonomy is better than bureaucracy, and we should encourage trust and mutual aid. DRR keeps showing this. It still keeps trying to. So the empirical research and ethnographic research always shows that grassroots efforts are more effective and better. People are less traumatized and so on in many, many ways than overly bureaucratized top-down disaster relief efforts. Yet still the discipline keeps carving out new roles for itself, and the bureaucracy keeps carving out new roles for itself. I'd argue that we should trust that most people respond cooperatively through mutual aid, and not necessarily, the state shouldn't try to control that. Although obviously I'm not the state, so I can't do that. So rather than trying to coordinate groups from a sort of top-down perspective, which is what this sort of cybernetic disaster risk reduction policy tries to do, sort of ideas of harmonization that actually comes from like the utopian socialists like Fourier and so on. But so modes of organization might involve, for example, a spokes council or affinity group or subgroup model, which allows to divide tasks and functions, but without having an overarching authority or bureaucracy. So the idea is to fit tasks to people rather than people to tasks. Or groups to tasks and so on. Rather than saying this group has to do this, the group sort of decides what needs done and what it's good at and able to do. Don't replicate state security. So I'd argue that norms ought to be loosened and not tightened, because people's normal coping strategies are unavailable during disasters. So that's partly about the sort of kind of morality of people judging each other in terms of their lifestyles under lockdown and so on, and sort of operating through this kind of quite blamey, shamey mentality to people that might have broken rules or something. It's worth bearing in mind that people's normal coping strategies might not be available. Also ceasefires and moratoriums. So in some ways, I think that cooperating with hierarchical groups or groups whose principles don't necessarily match might be worthwhile in a disaster, because really sort of recovering from this cosmic existential threat and, the physical danger or whatever is the primary goal. So, for example, Occupy Sandy cooperated very successfully with a lot of community groups and churches that didn't necessarily have the same principles. Okay, the idea that disasters are political. So rather than saying they're apolitical, the fact is that choices over recovery and post-disaster changes are for the affected community and not central state or other external actors or technocrats. So in my ideal world, people would make decisions over community recovery through sort of direct democracy and consensus, rather than rules handed down from the top down. Okay, against the kind of efficiency and cost effectiveness imperative, I'd argue that trust is vital. So coercion, penny pinching, self-seeking and incompetence undermine trust. Obviously that's something capitalists do, but anyone can do it, I suppose. Information should be honest, that's important. And opposing views should be rebutted rather than repressed. So open discussion is important. I think it's important to avoid purism as well. So funding can help sustain projects. So obviously this is a less utopian and more in the field kind of argument, but funding can help sustain projects, support activists, avoid burnout, etc. But it needs very careful attention to the conditions attached. So I'm a bit concerned that some of my talk today might seem like I'm saying don't cooperate with the state or, even non-radical groups in any way. And that's not what I want to say. And hopefully when I've written my book, there's a lot more in some of the later chapters about how Occupy Sandy very successfully negotiated some of these tensions. And I'm also happy to discuss that more in the discussion. And also the view of the subject. I'd argue that people are neither rational agents nor Hobbesian irrational subjects. People are complex bundles of forces held together by various meanings and desire structures. And any kind of idea around or philosophy and action around how we act in disasters should treat people as diverse creatures with differing needs, desires, capabilities, and so on. So we should allow individuals rights to respond autonomously, including non-compliance with the status quo to the extent it doesn't infringe on the consent of other people. Okay, so those are sort of some initial ideas I've got, but they're not really practical tactics. I do talk more in later chapters in my book about how, as I said, how Occupy Sandy and other groups, when I get around to analysing my interview data from COVID-19, I'm going to talk about more practical tactics people have used or experiences people have had of co-optation. But I'm going to open it up for discussion here now, and I'd really like to know if anyone who's on the call here has encountered any of these kind of, I'll put DDR again, DRR, disaster risk reduction type ideas, or attempted co-optation during their own mutual aid and activism. And how do you react? How do you cope with it? Also, I didn't discuss this, but certainly I think I implied it, that a lot of the DRR stuff seems to be coming out in kind of everyday citizens, kind of when they're not radical citizens or radicalized, and involved in mutual aid groups. It's come because it's sort of so prevalent in mainstream discourse, policy, media, and so on. It's obviously part of mainstream consciousness, and that includes grassroots people. And in fact, that's purposefully part of the sort of decentralized cybernetic logic of the beast that we're dealing with, is that everyday citizens sort of embody this logic. So I'm interested if anyone's encountered that, either from a state agency or from just another person. And if so, how did you react? And what are some problems or difficulties with these sort of proposed utopian ideas I've come up with? How might they fail in real world situations? What are some tactics to help maintain autonomy? And do these tactics differ whether we're dealing with repression or co-optation? These are just some broad ideas I've got for discussion. If you've got questions for me, I'm open to having a go at answering them, although I might not be able to. But really, I just want to open up a discussion about kind of practical tactics at this point. So I think that's me. Can I hand over to the facilitator, please?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was absolutely so interesting. I learned so much. It kind of gave a lot of context for a lot of what we went through during the pandemic, and which also has made me like really, really angry. Like just, kind of like, because you see all these things happening, and now you kind of like see them as part of like, a bigger plan, a bigger strategy, and how they fit together. And it just makes you like, yeah, I really want to like smash some shit up. But but yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, as you were saying, if people now want to do contributions, with giving a go to answering some of these like questions or giving some ideas or asking some questions, you should be able to do. If you don't want to do that, you can, write a message on the chat saying that you want to speak, or even if you click on the icon of your name, you should be able to raise your hand. But yeah, if possible, to kind of like make it a bit more interactive. If people want to like speak, unmute themselves and speak out. If not, I can read the stuff. But yeah, for example, we have something here from Carrie and Ivo. I don't know if they want to unmute themselves and say what they wanted to say.
Yeah, I can say it. So we had obviously a mutual aid group here, and we had a Labour councillor join our mutual aid group. It was a very small one. There was only about 10 of us in the group, in quite a small area. And that was really interesting, because she did two things. The first thing she wanted to do was for us to join her residents association, which was over a bigger area, which we didn't want to do. We had a group discussion. We decided we didn't want to do that. We wanted to stay small and autonomous from that residents association, which was established. And then when we didn't do that, she offered us funding, which was really interesting. And both ways seemed, because she was in the group, but she obviously felt a lack of control because she was late into the group. She was very late into the whole thing, really. And so was trying to sort of find her way of kind of, I don't know what the word is. I mean, she was co-opting us, but her way of establishing some control, I think, over what we were doing. So that was quite interesting. There was like a couple of tactics that she used.
Yeah, I've heard this a lot. I've read a lot of articles about it. These Labour councillors, and it always seems to be Labour councillors that did similar things, and it's even like the amount I've heard it and the amount they seem to be doing the same things, I don't know, it's even making me question if there's something more sinister going on, but I don't want to speculate what it might be because I sound like a conspiracy theorist and I've got no idea, but it just sounds absolutely bizarre that this same scenario has repeated itself in so many places. I mean, yeah, I really don't know, but I've certainly heard about that happening.
I think, yeah, it's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, we just ignored her, so
yeah,
it didn't really matter in the end. But
I should write that down, actually. That's a great strategy. Just ignore them. That's a tactic. There we go. I think that's our first tactic. Ignore them. And did that work? And did you all decide mutually to ignore them, or did you just it just happened?
We had a sort of open discussion, which she was part of, and we decided not to go with the Residents' Association, and then we decided we didn't really have any use for any funding, so we didn't really want any, and we were just happy carrying on as we were and doing what we were doing. So that was that really.
Oh, well done. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in hearing more about these people because I keep hearing the same thing again, and I saw something. I won't go into too much detail, but I saw something similar in my mutual aid group as well, where they did seem to take over a bit, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Sorry, I was just going to say, the other thing I think that helped was we established kind of the rules of communication and the non-hierarchical principles really early on, right at the start of the group, and therefore she really wasn't able to establish any sort of control over anybody because we'd got into a way of communicating and a way of making decisions.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm glad it worked out in your group because I know that in some groups these people really did gain quite a lot of influence, I think, whereas other groups it was kind of something in between, I guess. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for telling me about your experience.
Yeah, there's a question from Kathy that is quite interesting. I don't know if you want me to read it out or if you can repeat it yourself.
Oh yeah, the one in the chat box.
Yeah.
Kathy, okay, I've got brilliant talk. Thanks, Ree. I feel like the notion that people are complex bundles of forces held together by various meanings and desire structures has unfortunately already been co-opted via complexity/systems theory approaches to disaster management and international development. Have you come across this in your research? I've certainly come across complexity theory, and I suppose if we think about sort of post-human approaches, I can see what's happening. I mean, I'm more interested in we've all got different ideas of what the human subject is, and personally I quite like sort of psychoanalytic theories and the idea that people are driven by unconscious desires and so on, though not necessarily like Freudian, but I definitely think people are complex, and I think that's a fundamental issue. And I mean, I'm sure that could be co-opted, but I don't know what the alternative, I'm sort of almost trying to say people are diverse and unfathomable. And I think that the only alternative to thinking that is thinking that people are controllable or, completely understandable, which I don't know what the other alternatives would be. But it's definitely something that I'd be really interested to discuss with someone in more depth. If Kathy's got a comeback for that, or if there's anything you'd like to point me towards, or if there's anything I missed there. But I think largely I was just trying to think of an alternative to this behaviorist idea that people can be treated like machines where there's an input and an output, and it's a sort of behaviorist idea as well, that it doesn't matter what's inside people. All that matters is that they behave in the way you want them to behave, if you see what I mean. So I think it does matter what's inside people, even though we can't necessarily always understand that. So someone else has replied, I think the beliefs and values people hold and the meaning they give can't be underestimated. And I'd completely agree with that. I mean, I think that's exactly the point I was hoping to make. That's very well put. Okay.
there's also on the Twitch chat, which you cannot see, there's someone who is saying that they are trying to launch a mutual aid project in their local area, and they say that existing projects will not work with them unless we work within a bureaucratized framework. Half insurance, half our premises inspected, and half a food hygiene certificate. Which I saw that as well in my groups with like the council trying to get us to do like criminal background checks and all that kind of bullshit. Which I think that's pretty common.
Yeah, that's definitely really common, and I think different groups reacted to it differently. I mean, some sort of tried to put some measures in place, and I believe there's documents online to help people with safeguarding issues and things like that. And obviously, there are some issues like I was doing some cycling for a project, and it wasn't an explicitly mutual aid project. It was just a local community project, and I was delivering meals. And when we delivered the meals, we had a piece of paper that had people's names, addresses, phone numbers on, and so on. And obviously, like, once you've delivered the meal, you don't want to just drop that on the floor where someone could pick it up and have some vulnerable people's details. There are important things to do, but I think when people start telling you that you need to do some kind of course and get certificates, I mean, that's interesting because that gets to the heart of this, the very tension that sort of is within the state approaches. So these disaster risk reduction kind of documents constantly talk about how the reason that these local groups are more resilient is because they're more flexible, because they don't have to go through the same amount of red tape and rules as a bureaucratized group. But then in the same breath, they say, these things are great. How do we co-opt them into the mainstream and regulate them, And it seems to me that's like the fundamental tension at the heart of this thing is, the fact that non-bureaucratized groups are better, but the bureaucracy wants to exist and find a role for itself, So I think, trying to find a way to resist bureaucratization while still organizing is important. But I don't know what the answer is always.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons these kind of like mutual aid initiatives can appear so quickly and so widespread during like crises is because the state has lost legitimacy, has lost power, has lost ground, so it's not as able to like put the fees on the table and say you have to get these certificates and all that. Like the council was telling us get this like certificate for people, and we were just say like no, we don't need it, that is bullshit, that is just discriminatory, that it goes against us. And then we kept going because at that point we were in a position of power where if just because the state was telling us to do something, we didn't have to because we didn't need them. But now that we're kind of getting to that the state is regaining control, is regaining power, that becomes harder. So you kind of have to like, I imagine, probably like, build that power much more slowly, build that autonomy much more slowly, and to the point where the state has to bend to you. So yeah, you're gonna have probably right now what people will need to do is kind of like, try not to get caught, to try not to like bend to this request and go and build power very slowly until they can say like, well, now we are like, we don't need you, so we are not going to follow your request. If you want to help us, that's up to you, but we are the ones with the power, we are the ones with the in control. That will say, that will be my idea, but that has to be put in action. So definitely just like, don't listen to me just because I say so.
Yeah, agreed.
There is another interesting comment in the chat is from SEO. They say that many local residents in the area thought they were the mutual aid group was part of the council, and that to counteract that they went door knocking and told as many people as possible who they actually were.
Yeah, that's really interesting too. Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, that's obviously really important as well, because you don't want to have people labouring under false illusions, I suppose.
Yeah, we definitely had that a few times when we like were delivering food to people, and they were like, "Oh, who are you? Are you with the council, or are you with an organization?" And we always say, "No, we are just neighbors helping each other." And that seems actually some people were like, "Oh, that's better."
I mean, it's funny that that's kind of surprising or questionable. That neighbours would help each other in mutual aid, but I suppose that is the world that we live in. It's very well, or at least that some people live in. It's very sort of isolated and privatized, and yeah. But yeah, it's really good that people are willing to accept it as well.
Yeah. Any more like contributions people have, or questions, or just kind of talk about their experiences with mutual aid?
I know. I just wanted to say to Ches, who's put in the chat, I wrote this about my experience with this sort of thing in Tower Hamlets a while ago. I think I've already read that and referenced it. I'm hoping to reference it in my book that I'm writing to the website. So thanks for writing that. I'm just having a quick look in the chat. Are there any more questions?
Yeah.
It was very cathartic. Haha. Yeah, no, it's a really good article. Thanks. And the picture's great as well.
Carrie is also saying there were also some people in mutual aid groups who are also fighting for control. Two things: wanted to be giving charity to poorer people, but so there could be thought there could be funding. I don't know, Carrie, do you want to like come back and speak about it about this a bit more?
Yeah, I think I sort of noticed that there was sort of sort of very white middle class thing around the COVID mutual aid, and there was this sort of idea about sort of feeling that you were really doing good by giving to people who were poorer or more vulnerable, weren't really free or able to accept support themselves. So there was that kind of thing going on, a bit of a charitable kind of philanthropic kind of mindset, and also there was this sort of feeling of might be funding after this, so if people sort of did some good bit of work, they might get a career out of it or something.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I noticed with Occupy Sunday as well, and it's definitely something that those activists were aware of, and especially those who worked with communities who were kind of noticeably a very different class or ethnic background to themselves, and they felt very much like there were these kind of different people swooping in to help, and that there was this charitable thing, which mutual aid is meant to be about sort of helping each other. But if there's a massive disparity in kind of privilege or wealth or education between the helper and helped, whether they're professionalized or not, then obviously one sort of group is going to be giving more help and the other group's going to be doing more receiving. And I think that's, I don't think there's any point in anyone feeling guilty about that or feel like they're going against their principles, because we live in an alienated society, and that's a symbol of capitalist alienation rather than anyone necessarily doing anything wrong, I think. But it's certainly worth being aware of. But the idea that people were in it for sort of professionalized careers is also interesting. That's not something I thought about quite as much, but now that you've mentioned it, it's certainly some people who I've interviewed, especially in Occupy Sandy, kind of did make careers out of what they did during that relief effort. And again, I don't think you can question people's motive. I mean, if they're only doing it for that, I think you might question their ability to sort of empathize and work in solidarity with people properly. But on the other hand, everyone's got to earn a living or survive somehow. So the idea that people might want to use their skills to find a job later, I guess. Yeah, I mean, they're all tensions that we've got to navigate. I mean, does anyone have any kind of ideas around that? Because certainly it could be seen as exploitative, I suppose, if you're exploiting people in order to sort of get a foot up. But on the other hand, I sort of sometimes worry about whether doing interviews with people and then using it in research, you know, with it, radical people who I'm in solidarity with, and using it in research, is that kind of vampiric in a sense? And I do sort of constantly worry and question that. But then I think, well, if I wasn't doing it, no one would be writing about this stuff and thinking about this stuff and maybe talking with activists about it and talking to students about it, so students can talk about these ideas. And I suppose if somebody wasn't trying to make a career out of helping people, then people wouldn't be doing that as well. Sorry, I'll probably dig myself into a hole trying to think about this, because it is something that worrying about the contradictions of surviving in a capitalist society is a kind of wormhole to go down. But I'm definitely interested in anything else anyone else has got to say about that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's quite a complicated one. I think, you know, they mentioned something that came up a bit in my experience is that, yeah, there were like people with like very different interests and very different perspectives, and something that we talk about and I thought about is that at some point you just have to kind of like, you know, bring the principle of free association into all of this, and say, like, you know, if you are a person who is coming from like a privileged background and you're kind of here just to like get your career up here, maybe you don't need to be here. You know, maybe we don't need to associate with you. Like, you know, people who actually need it, you know, we'll like organize among ourselves, and you know, you can go and find a charity to join.
Yeah.
And yeah, sometimes I heard this idea of like, you know, we have to be inclusive of everyone, and we have to be welcoming to everyone. And, you know, I think like, yeah, you have to be a bit more like skeptical about that, and a bit more cynical, and just, you know, enforce the idea that, you know, like this is for people to help each other, and for people who need it, not, you know, not for people to make their careers out of it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
There's also some really interesting discussion going in the chat, which I've seen online before. But, you know, people are saying that, you know, given the, you know, certain definitions of mutual aid as, you know, a form of political participation in which people take responsibility for caring for one another and changing political conditions, they're just not sure if the mutual aid groups that came out about during the COVID-19 crisis in UK will qualify as mutual aid groups at all.
Yeah.
I don't know, what is your opinion about that?
My opinion, I mean, I think there is like massive diversity in the mutual aid groups, and personally I think mutual aid is a concept with a background in anarchism. You know, theoretically it comes from Kropotkin, and as a practice, even when people don't self-define it as mutual aid, it's something that working class people have traditionally had to engage in more than you know, middle class or privilege, or you know, upper class capitalists, for example, because those people don't do mutual aid. They're kind of parasitic off other people, or you know, they can pay other people to do stuff, so they don't need mutual aid, I guess. So, you know, to me, mutual aid is a kind of radical anarchist and sort of working class concept. And it's certainly true that people are trying to sort of recuperate that at the moment, which I think is dangerous, and I find it quite upsetting as well when I look at sort of historical and previous examples of mutual aid. But I also think there is some awareness of that, and there's radical groups you know, working to resist that as well. And I think there is just a great diversity amongst the groups that I'm aware of, at least. But I certainly don't think they're completely not, you know, I don't think you could sort of blanket say, oh, you know, they couldn't be called mutual aid groups, because I definitely think some were. And then I was involved in a group which I think, you know, had a very mutual aid vibe, but it wasn't actually called mutual aid. It was just a sort of local community group. It was sort of people organising meals and delivering them to people under a different name. So I think mutual aid happens anyway, even when it's not called mutual aid. And sometimes people call things mutual aid that aren't mutual aid. Perhaps they're just an exercise in career building, or, you know, for like middle class philanthropy or something. But yeah, sorry, am I going on a bit too long?
No, yeah, that makes complete sense, and I also think it's worth noting that, you know, the lack of infrastructure in terms of like, you know, mutual aid networks and organization in the UK is just pretty huge compared to like other countries, in my experience. So like we have to kind of see this as like a first step in a much longer like fight to build these kind of structures, and as such, you know, we have to take the time to celebrate what was good about it, and because that's important, because otherwise you'll always be depressed and say that nothing is good enough, but then also like prepare ourselves to like the next step and the next step.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, do you want to like speak out, since you have something to say in terms of like resisting co-optation of Labour councils?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. All right, nice one. Yeah, something we found really useful against the sort of like Labour council activisty kind of people who are trying to like bureaucratize things and make it less political, I guess, was just like really kind of call them out on the bullshit really directly. Because they like to kind of like, I don't know, kind of step around issues and talk about things in this really like, oh, we have to be like sickly sweet with each other at all times kind of thing, that I guess just kind of more middle class Labour types I just like, I guess, I don't know. And then just being really direct to them and being like, look, we see what you're doing, like that's not mutual aid though. You know, you're trying to do something that isn't mutual aid, and we will speak out against that. And that seemed to like really kind of set them off balance a little bit, and kind of took them down a peg, and kind of made the whole thing like a little bit more mutual aidy again, just because they knew that there was people there who would kind of be like, no, stop trying to take over, we see what you're doing, and just being like sickeningly polite about it doesn't make it any better. I don't know if that would be a universal experience, but it certainly worked in Tower Hamlets to some degree anyway.
It wouldn't surprise me actually, because it completely fits into kind of what third way ideology is, which, you know, the idea of the third way, which is the kind of Blairite thing, isn't it? And he was the sort of biggest neoliberal of all, but the whole idea of this third way is it's sort of finding a middle way between this way and that, you know. It's this kind of enforced consensus. It's the idea that everyone can be incorporated and everybody can be, you know, included. But it just kind of, and the idea there's sort of no time for politicizing. It's like the idea that, you know, you can have something that isn't politics, you know, you can just do what everyone agrees is correct, you know. That's another phrase they come out with, but I think it would be a pretty cool, pretty universal experience of dealing with, you know, these kind of people, to be honest. I think it's sort of a fundamental part of the ideology, I guess.
Yeah, and that made me think on another thing that that was very interesting, is, you know, the idea of like, although I think, you know, you cannot use these groups as an opportunity to launch, you know, your anarchist project and kind of like use it in like a very utilitarian way. I think it's very useful when you can like expand the remit of what people think mutual aid is, and include other causes that are also like related, you know, like during the COVID-19, the housing crisis, the eviction crisis, all these kind of things. Or you know, and you know, I had like a really good experience like when the BLM protests were happening, of like recruiting a massive amount of people from the mutual aid groups to participate in arrestee support outside of police stations. And it, you know, it's not exactly the same what people were thinking when they joined mutual aid, but I think, you know, they were much more like, once those networks were there, once those relationships were there, and people were kind of like up for helping each other, that apparently that seemed like a logical extension, because, you know, like I got like, I don't know how many people I got in the chat, but it was quite a lot. And that was, you know, for and either arresty support can be quite radical when you have to be like when you have the police just giving you bullshit and trying to get you to leave with all kinds of like underhanded tactics. So like it was quite interesting to see that like happening.
Yeah. Sorry, I got a bit distracted. I was just reading. I may have looped into that's a charity, not mutual aid, mate post. What? Sorry, I don't know. So I'm just reading something in the chat. I'm not sure I understand it. Is it? Hello. Are you still there?
Yeah,
sorry,
no, sure.
I said at the end there, Angus. Sorry, I'm getting confused.
Yeah, but in any case, we're kind of like going a bit over time. But yeah, I don't know if people want like like a few more contributions. Maybe I will go after like 8:45.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm starting to gibber a bit now because I think I'm getting a bit tired, but I'm certainly interested in other people's contributions.
Yeah, so if people have like if people want to do some final contributions, if not, I'll do the kind of the exit. Yeah, the arresty support worked quite well. It kind of had to be dismantled because of like some reasons of the chat, being lost for different reasons and stuff like that. But when it was working, it worked quite well. Like, comrades who were used to kind of like, when they get out, it's always the same people doing arresty support from each other. But in this case, they were like just a bunch of unknown people, and all were part of this chat, were just waiting outside the station.
Another thing I'd like to add, actually, and sorry if I've been a bit tired towards the end here and started gibbering, but I'd really like at least 2 more people, if they'd be willing, anyone who might be willing to be interviewed about their experience of mutual aid for this book I'm writing. I'd really could do with at least 2 more people, and who'd be willing to talk about their experiences with the mutual aid groups. And hopefully some people I've interviewed have said they found it quite a valuable experience in terms of thinking through their experiences and so on. And then anything I write will be sort of completely anonymous in the book. I'll just sort of take out shorter quotes to quote in the book, and then it'll be completely anonymous and I won't mention any names. So if anyone would like to volunteer, I'm not quite sure how to tell you to get in touch with me. Maybe what could I do? I could type my email in the chat box, and then it's
and maybe if other people want to contact you, maybe they can contact GAF on Facebook or whatever, and we'll like we'll ask as middlemen.
Yeah,
that's okay.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to ask you is some people in the chat on the live stream have requested if it would be possible to have access to the presentation afterwards.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to do that.
Cool. So yeah, if you can send that to me, I'll put it up somewhere and I'll make it public.
Yeah, certainly. No problem at all.
Cool. So yeah, I think maybe this is a good moment to wind down. It has been a really amazing talk, really, really interesting. I've learned a lot. I'm going to be kind of probably going over it a few more times myself. So yeah, thanks so much for coming.
I'm glad it was all right. I was quite nervous because it's a different audience than I'm used to presenting to. So I'm really glad it was okay.
Yes, it certainly was great. So yeah, and yeah, thanks to everyone for being here and contributing and sharing their experiences and their opinions. It was really, really interesting. And yeah, as always, you can, if you want to learn more about the Green Anti-Capitalist Front and what we're up to, you can go to our website, greenanticapitalist.org. And you can see the events that we have coming up, the different stuff we are supporting and doing, and as always, check our aims and principles. And even if there's no if you don't want to join or can join any of the existing like GAF groups or clusters or networks or whatever. You can just do shit on your own, be autonomous, get a few friends, smash some shit, like fuck something up or help some people, and then just call it under GAF. And if you help with that, and you need some ideas or whatever, so support, also write to us, and we'll do whatever we can. So yeah, I think that's going to be most of it for today. Just to remind people that next week we have a reading group. We are going to be focusing on a specific book called Braiding Sweetgrass. We'll be reading like different chapters from it. It's quite interesting. I'm kind of trying to make my way through it. But yeah, and after that, we haven't announced anything officially because I have to still get my shit together about that talk. But the next talk is hopefully we're going to be about abolitionism, and it's going to have like some one or two really interesting speakers as well. So yeah, that's going to be all for us. Thanks so much, everyone. I hope to see you soon here online or in the streets, in the barricades, whatever it is. As always, thanks so much, everyone. And death to capitalism, death to the state, death to capitalism, death to colonialism. See you soon. Goodbye, everyone.